Can you believe that an entire civilization, everything we now understand as freedom, democracy, philosophy, and art, was once balancing on the knife edge of extinction, ready to be swallowed whole by an unstoppable, obsidian wave of absolute power? This isn't just history. This is the story of the single most terrifying moment in antiquity, a catastrophe no one saw coming with enough force to resist it. They called themselves the Hellenes, the people of the sun, scattered across sun-drenched islands and rocky peninsulas, bickering over olives and harbor rights. They were small, divided, and utterly unprepared for the shadow that was about to fall over their world. A shadow cast by a billion-dollar war machine, the colossal Persian Empire, an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on its dominion, ruled by a man who genuinely believed he was a living god, Darius the Great. And Darius was furious, not just annoyed, but gripped by a cold, searing, generational rage that demanded total, uncompromising revenge. His fury was the ignition switch for the battle that would define the entire course of the West. The legendary stand at Marathon. But to understand the sheer terror of that day, you must first understand why the great King of Kings decided that the tiny, insignificant city-state of Athens needed to be utterly wiped from the map, its citizens enslaved, and its democracy buried forever under a mountain of salt. It all began with a desperate, foolish cry for help, a whisper of rebellion that turned into a scream of agony far to the east, along the coast of Asia Minor. This was Ionia, a collection of Greek cities that had already fallen under the Persian yoke, forced to pay tribute and accept the rule of Persian-appointed tyrants. They had suffered for decades, but the taste of freedom, even if ancient and half-remembered, was too sweet to forget entirely. In 499 BCE, fueled by a combination of despair and misplaced hope, the Ionian cities rose up in a coordinated, desperate revolt against their masters. This was a death wish, but desperation knows no strategy. And who did they turn to? The only free Greeks close enough to offer aid: Sparta, who famously refused, claiming the venture was too far and too dangerous, effectively sealing the Ionians' fate. But Athens, driven partly by democratic kinship and partly by a deep-seated territorial rivalry with Persia, made the fateful decision. They sent 20 ships. 20 ships. It was an insulting number, a symbolic gesture, yet it was enough to light the fuse on the biggest geopolitical powder keg the ancient world had ever seen. Those 20 Athenian triremes sailed east, joining the Ionian rebels, and together they committed an act of unbelievable, almost cinematic audacity. They marched inland and burned Sardis to the ground. Sardis was not just a city. It was a major Persian administrative hub, a crown jewel in the imperial structure, and a place where Darius kept vast stockpiles of wealth and power. To burn Sardis was not just an attack. It was a slap across the face of the living God. When news reached Susa, the capital of the Achaemenid Empire, the court stopped breathing. Imagine the silence, the sheer, unimaginable audacity of these small, irrelevant Westerners daring to challenge the unstoppable Titan. Darius, magnificent and terrible on his throne, demanded to know who was responsible for this sacrilege. The response was simple: the Athenians. This single word became the obsession of the most powerful man in the world. Legend tells us that Darius made a sacred vow, a pact with the heavens, that he would have his vengeance upon Athens. To ensure he never forgot this sacred duty, he commanded one of his servants to stand before him 3 times every day, even during meals, and utter the chilling, repetitive mantra: "Master, remember the Athenians." This was not merely a military campaign. It was a divine execution order. Darius didn't just want to defeat Athens. He wanted to unmake it, to erase the concept of a self-governing people from history, proving that all men must bow to the King of Kings. The Ionian revolt was eventually crushed, savagely and completely. The cities were reduced to rubble, and the surviving populations were massacred or dragged away in chains. A terrifying display of what happens when you anger the Colossus. But the incident at Sardis, those 20 insignificant Athenian ships, had drawn the eye of the storm directly toward the small, rocky shores of Attica. The Persian war machine, accustomed to swallowing continents, began to pivot, slowly but inexorably, toward the west. The first attempt in 492 BCE, led by Darius's son-in-law, Mardonius, was thwarted not by Greek courage, but by the relentless fury of nature. A massive storm off the treacherous coast of Mount Athos utterly annihilated the Persian fleet, sinking hundreds of ships and drowning thousands of elite troops. The Greeks breathed a collective, momentary sigh of relief, believing the gods themselves had intervened to protect them. They were wrong. The storm had simply delayed the inevitable. Darius saw this setback not as a warning, but as a minor logistical inconvenience, a mere speed bump on the road to total conquest. He immediately began planning the second, far more precise, and far more devastating invasion. This time, there would be no long, vulnerable coastal march. This time, the Persians would sail straight across the Aegean, bypassing the treacherous northern routes, and land directly on the soft underbelly of Greece. In 491 BCE, Darius sent ambassadors, heralds of doom, to every major Greek city-state, demanding the ritual submission, earth and water. This was the ultimate test of loyalty, a recognition of Persian supremacy. Most cities, paralyzed by fear and recognizing the futility of resistance, immediately handed over the tokens of their sovereignty. How could they possibly stand against the might of the Medes and the Persians, the legendary immortals? But two cities, two beacons of defiant freedom, gave the ambassadors a response that would forever be etched in the annals of human courage, or perhaps human insanity. When the Persian envoys arrived in Sparta, they were thrown down a well and told, "There is your earth and water." The gauntlet had been thrown. The line was drawn. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown between the nascent idea of freedom and the ancient reality of empire. Darius understood the message perfectly. There would be no peaceful surrender. There would be war. A war so definitive it would determine whether the West would ever exist at all. The Greek world suddenly realized the true horror of their situation. The immense Persian fleet, a horrifying armada of hundreds of triremes and transports, began its slow, inevitable journey across the Aegean, carrying tens of thousands of hardened warriors. This was not a punitive raid. This was an extinction event. The Athenians looked toward the sea, knowing that any day now the sails of the enemy would blot out the horizon, and when they landed, there would be no retreat, only death. The final destination of that fleet, the place where two worlds would collide in a bloody, impossible fight for the soul of civilization, was the quiet, unsuspecting plain of Marathon. And the countdown to destiny had begun. The year is 490 BC, and the Aegean Sea itself seemed to groan under the weight of the coming storm. When the Athenian scouts first spotted the silhouettes against the dawn, they didn't see men. They saw a moving forest, a plague of iron and bronze stretching across the horizon, consuming the shoreline like a rapidly spreading metallic blight. This wasn't just an army. It was the operational mechanism of an empire that spanned 3 continents, an engine of conquest designed to crush all resistance under its meticulously organized heel, extinguishing the very concept of freedom. Estimates of the Achaemenid force vary wildly, depending on whose scroll you read. But even the most conservative tallies paint a picture of inescapable, existential doom for the Greeks. We are talking about maybe 25,000 to 30,000 soldiers, the finest the ancient world had ever marshaled, composed of Median archers, deadly sakas, and the legendary, terrifying Persian immortals. They arrived in a coordinated, utterly professional landing operation, a testament to the logistical genius of the empire. The plain of Marathon itself was chosen deliberately. It was a wide, shallow crescent of land, perfect for deploying the one weapon the Greeks fundamentally feared and could not defeat in open terrain, the Persian cavalry. Leading this armada of annihilation were 2 names that struck terror into every Greek heart. Artaphernes, the nephew of the great King Darius himself, providing the strategic weight and imperial authority, and Datis, the ruthless Median admiral, the man tasked with delivering swift, brutal destruction. Their goal was frighteningly simple: revenge for the burning of Sardis, the restoration of the puppet tyrant Hippias, who was now marching with them, whispering advice about Athenian weaknesses, and the immediate total subjugation of the entire Greek peninsula under the iron fist of Persia. They landed their horses first, hundreds upon hundreds of Thessalian and Median cavalry, specialized shock troops that could shatter the tight ranks of any Greek hoplite phalanx with sheer kinetic force. The Athenians watched this procession of doom from the surrounding hills, their fear curdling into cold, desperate dread as they realized the full scale of the monstrous military apparatus arrayed against them. This was not a punitive raid. This was regime change, engineered by the most powerful man on earth, Darius I, designed to erase Athens from the map of free cities entirely. The sheer terror of the moment was paralyzing. The city was gripped by panic, a physical force that squeezed the breath from every citizen. Their political enemy, Hippias, was rumored to be right there, promising to guide the invaders to the city's weakest points, ready to seize power again amidst the bloodshed and civil breakdown. The Athenian assembly convened in a frenzy, arguing, pleading, paralyzed by the colossal magnitude of the threat, knowing that if the Persians reached the city walls, treachery from within was almost certain. But amidst the despair, one decision had to be made immediately. They needed help, and they needed it now. Desperate, clinging to the slim hope of their powerful neighbors, the Athenians turned their eyes south, toward the famously militaristic, almost mythical city-state of Sparta, the only power capable of fielding an army large and skilled enough to potentially stand against the great king. And so the legend was born, tied forever to the destiny of that moment, a tale that would echo through history for millennia. They called upon their best runner, the hemerodromos, the day-long runner, Phidippides. His mission was not merely a delivery. It was a suicidal, desperate plea, a race against the end of the world. He was tasked to run 150 miles across treacherous mountain paths, through hostile terrain, to beg the Spartans to mobilize their legendary army before the Persian tidal wave engulfed everything. Phidippides ran like a man chased by the shadow of the Persian Empire itself, driven by the knowledge that the fate of his entire world rested on the integrity of his muscles and lungs. He crossed the unforgiving plains of Argolis, scrambled over the jagged peaks of Mount Parthenion, battling exhaustion, fear, and the sheer impossibility of the distance, pushing his body past the limits of human endurance. He reached Sparta, breathless, his body wrecked, and delivered the single most important message in Athenian history, a cry torn from the heart of a dying democracy. Men of Sparta, the Athenians ask you to hasten to their aid and not allow the most ancient city of Greece to fall into bondage to the barbarians. But history, ever a merciless mistress, dealt the Athenians a crushing, soul-destroying blow. The Spartans, adhering to a strict, ancient religious law, the highly sacred festival of the Carneia, could not mobilize their troops or march until the moon was full. A mandated delay of nearly 10 agonizing days. 10 days. 10 days that the massive Persian army would use to consolidate their position, set up their logistics, and prepare for the final march of destruction on Athens. Phidippides returned with the devastating, crushing news. Athens was alone. Absolutely, terrifyingly alone. It was Athens and her single, tiny, faithful ally, the city of Plataea, who sent perhaps 600 hoplites to stand beside them against the entire might of the Achaemenid Empire. This microscopic coalition of 10,000 Athenians and 600 Plataeans stood in the hills, facing down the engine of conquest. Their hope shattered, their backs already pressed against the unforgiving cliffs. The Athenian army, comprised entirely of hoplites, citizen soldiers, farmers, and craftsmen who had paid for their own armor, had moved out, taking up a defensive position in the rugged foothills overlooking the Marathon Plain, blocking the two main roads leading to Athens. They were led by 10 strategoi, generals, and immediately a fierce existential debate erupted among them, a debate that carried the weight of civilization itself. On one side stood the cautious voices, terrified by the overwhelming Persian numbers, arguing to retreat immediately, to fall back within the massive defenses of the city walls, trusting the fortifications to hold until the Spartans finally arrived. This was the sensible choice, the safe choice, the choice of prudence. On the other side stood the radical, brilliant, and deeply experienced voice of Miltiades. Miltiades had lived among the Persians. He understood their army, their tactics, and their ruthlessness, having served as a vassal king in the cities. He knew with absolute certainty that hiding behind walls was slow suicide. He argued fiercely, desperately, that if they let the Persians march to Athens unopposed, the city would fracture under the fear. Collaborators, like Hippias's supporters, would rise up within the walls, and the fragile Athenian democracy would be strangled and overthrown before the first siege engine was even built. They had to strike now, on the plain, on their terms, utilizing the terrain to negate the terrifying Persian cavalry advantage. The fate of Athens, the future of the West, hung on a single vote, a moment of profound political drama that decided whether they would face the enemy in a desperate field battle or wait for the inevitable, treacherous siege. The polemarch, war archon, Callimachus, held the deciding vote, and the generals watched him, their own terror reflected in his eyes, knowing that his choice meant either glorious annihilation or unthinkable victory. The fate of the Hellenic world, the language we speak, the very foundations of democracy, all hung suspended on the trembling lips of one man, Callimachus. The war council was split, 5-5, a deadlock of despair and defiant courage. Waiting meant hope, the slim chance that the legendary Spartans, who were always late to every party that mattered, might actually arrive. But waiting also meant giving the great king's forces, those monstrous regiments of doom, time to maneuver, time to crush the Athenian spirit before the first arrow even flew.
It was Miltiades, the seasoned veteran, the general who knew the Persian threat intimately, who shattered the silence like a thunderbolt striking marble. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity that cut through the haze of fear. He did not ask Callimachus to vote. He commanded him to understand the simple, brutal arithmetic of their survival.
"If we do not strike now," Miltiades hissed, his voice raw with urgency, "the treachery in Athens, the whispers of those who favor the banished tyrant Hippias, will bloom into open revolt. Every day we delay, the resolve of our citizens curdles into panicked surrender. We will not be defeated by the Medes. We will be defeated by ourselves." The words hit Callimachus like a physical blow. He saw the truth, not in the abstract notion of distant Spartan reinforcements, but in the immediate, chilling reality of political collapse back home. If Athens fell internally, the Battle of Marathon would be rendered utterly meaningless. With a heavy sigh, a sound that echoed the closing of 1,000 years of history and the opening of a brutal new chapter, Callimachus cast his vote. Offensive action. Immediate attack. The 10 generals, now united by a single terrifying purpose, scrambled into motion, the fear instantly transmuted into ferocious, focused energy. The time for deliberation was over. The time for glorious annihilation had begun. The great plain of Marathon stretched before them, a deadly, glittering stage set for catastrophe. It was an unusual arena for a battle of this magnitude. Squeezed tightly between the rugged slopes of Mount Pentelicus and the treacherous, mosquito-infested marshes bordering the Aegean Sea. This bottleneck, this geographical choke point, was the Athenians' only true ally. The Persians, numbering perhaps 50,000 screaming multi-ethnic soldiers, a number so vast it seemed to defy physics, were used to fighting in wide open spaces, deploying their deadly cavalry, the pride of the Achaemenid Empire, in sweeping, overwhelming charges. But Miltiades saw the constrained space not as a limit, but as a weapon he could wield against the sheer scale of the invading host. He knew he could not meet the immense Persian line head-on. It was too deep, too heavy, too utterly overwhelming. He looked at his scant 10,000 hoplites, the citizen soldiers of Athens and the tiny allied force from Plataea, men whose previous engagements consisted mostly of civic disputes and farming. He had to invent a new way to fight, or perish instantly and completely. His genius materialized in the most desperate of gambits. He intentionally weakened his center line until it was only a few ranks deep, a mere facade, a suicide squad designed to absorb the inevitable shockwave of the main Persian infantry. The men placed here were given the most terrible assignment in military history: break, but break slowly. This was a suicidal tactic, calculated to fail in the middle, but calculated to win on the wings. He crammed the elite, hardened veterans, the full strength of the Athenian shields and spears, onto the flanks. On the far right, the traditional place of highest honor and highest danger, stood the polemarch Callimachus, determined to prove that his vote for war was not a vote for cowardice. This extreme concentration of power on the edges was the hammer Miltiades intended to swing. It was counterintuitive, radical, and borderline insane in the conventional military doctrine of the time. It looked like a broken line waiting to be pulverized. But Miltiades wasn't aiming for a static defense. He was setting a trap, a deadly, unforgiving embrace, engineered to ensnare the advancing masses of Medes, Sakas, and other imperial subjects. For days they stood there, two titans locked in a horrific staring contest across the plain. The Athenians, clad in bronze and sheer terror, watched the Persian cavalry detach and seemingly vanish, a strategic mystery that historians still debate, but which Miltiades interpreted as his final, fleeting window of opportunity. The cavalry, the most fearsome weapon in Darius's arsenal, was temporarily out of the picture. This was it. The decision was irrevocable. The sun beat down mercilessly on the plain. Miltiades gave the signal, and the Athenian hoplites, without waiting for the traditional steady marching pace, broke into a dead sprint. A distance of nearly a mile, covered at full speed, armored head to toe, screaming defiant battle cries, plunging headlong into the maw of the greatest empire the world had ever known. They ran not out of reckless courage, but out of sheer, overwhelming necessity, to close the gap, to minimize the deadly rain of Persian arrows, turning a potential massacre into a collision of monumental, terrifying proportions. The run itself was an act of tactical brilliance and physical agony, designed to shock the enemy and deliver the final, devastating, existential blow that would either save the West or bury it forever. The moment the strategos Miltiades gave the signal, the world went silent, then exploded. 8,000 Athenian hoplites, coupled with maybe 1,000 Plataean loyalists, dropped their collective breath into a single, terrifying scream. A sound that wasn't human, but the grinding shriek of history turning a corner. They moved, they ran, they committed to the dromos, the run of destiny, a distance of nearly a mile, maybe even more, across the unforgiving, sun-baked plain of Marathon. Imagine the weight. 70 pounds of bronze and wood strapped to the exhausted, terrified body of a civilian soldier who had slept little and prayed constantly. Every single step was a hammer blow to the knees. Every gasping breath dragged the dry air into lungs already burning from dehydration and pure, adrenaline-fueled terror. The Persian commanders, secure behind their line of stacked shields, watched this spectacle unfold, initially with confusion, then with mocking laughter and profound disbelief. They had never witnessed such an act of martial insanity. Their intelligence reports had been clear that the Greeks always marched methodically, adjusting their formation, reserving their energy for the slow, brutal shield wall shove. But these Athenians were throwing away every rule of warfare known to the great king. They were exhausting themselves before the first javelin even flew. Datis and Artaphernes, the supreme commanders, allowed their archers to relax, assuming the tiring Greeks would simply be easy targets, when they inevitably slowed down just before impact. But Miltiades understood one fatal truth that trumped all classical strategy. They could not afford the typical slow advance. If they walked, the Persian cloud of arrows, a literal hurricane of death, capable of blotting out the sun, would shred the thin Athenian ranks to ribbons before they even entered spear range. The run was a calculated, near-suicidal gamble. Trade physical exhaustion for crucial, life-saving seconds of protection, closing the lethal gap before the archers could reload, settle their aim, and launch their third, devastating volley. Then came the impact. It wasn't a gentle meeting of two disciplined lines. It was the sound of a mountain collapsing onto a tidal wave, a sudden, horrifying concussive shockwave that echoed across the quiet plain. The heavy bronze shields, rimmed with iron and backed by the force of thousands of running men, slammed into the wicker shields and linen armor of the first line of the Persian infantry with cataclysmic, bone-splintering force. The momentum of the run, the 70 pounds of bronze equipment, the primal rage of men fighting for their families and their gods, all converged into one single, crushing blow that instantly shattered the Persian front line in multiple places. This was the sheer, brutal power of the phalanx, the formation Darius had never truly comprehended, much less feared. It wasn't about individual heroics or swift cuts. It was a single 8,000-man organism powered by teamwork, discipline, and absolute, unforgiving pressure. The first ranks stabbed and shielded, while the ranks behind them, the second, the third, the fourth, and the eighth, pushed, lending their collective physical weight to the terrifying surge, making the front line an unstoppable, grinding battering ram of flesh and bronze. The disciplined, professional soldiers of the empire, the best light infantry the world had ever seen, were utterly thrown into disarray. Their lighter armor, perfect for speed and flanking maneuvers, suddenly became a fatal liability against the sheer, dense, overwhelming weight of the Greek shield wall. The Persian composite bows and sharp spears, so effective at range, were instantly rendered useless in this desperate, tightly packed, claustrophobic melee. This was a meat grinder built explicitly for heavy infantry, and the Persians found themselves drowning in a sea of their own panicked, tightly crushed bodies. But Miltiades had done something absolutely treacherous, something so audacious it risked total annihilation of Athens itself. He had deliberately weakened his center,
placing his best, most experienced hoplites on the far flanks, leaving the middle line thinner, lighter, and far more vulnerable to a decisive breakthrough. The Athenian center buckled. It groaned, it screamed, and then it broke, retreating exactly as Miltiades had commanded in his strategic blueprint. For a terrifying, heart-stopping few minutes, it looked to the terrified observers on the hills that the entire battle was irreversibly lost, that the Persian center had achieved the decisive victory. The Persians, roaring in triumphant ecstasy, believed they had cracked the nut, pushing deep into the heart of the Greek formation, chasing the seemingly defeated Athenians towards the hills and the interior. They tasted victory, feeling the sweet, irresistible surge of conquest flowing through their ranks like wine. But as the Persian elite surged forward, drunk on the scent of triumph, they failed completely to notice the silent steel jaws closing around their flanks. The heavy Athenian and Plataean wings, having utterly routed and shattered the lighter Persian wings opposing them, the Medes and Saka, the toughest warriors in Darius's massive army, suddenly realized they were not pursuing a defeated enemy. They had walked straight into a pre-dug, inescapable kill box. The Athenian hoplites, who had just finished routing their own opponents, now slammed into the exposed flanks and rear of the trapped Persian center with renewed, bloodthirsty vigor. This was no longer a battle of strategy or maneuver. It was a wholesale slaughter. The Persians were packed so tightly they couldn't even swing their weapons properly, couldn't deploy their devastating bows, and couldn't escape the relentless, grinding pressure of the bronze shields and the stabbing spear points coming at them from 3 directions. Panic became the absolute, defining factor that crushed the invasion force. The Persian High Command, realizing their elite shock troops were being systematically annihilated in the center, could only watch in paralyzing horror as the disciplined order of the massive invasion force dissolved into a desperate, primal scramble for survival. Their only goal now was the beach, the sand dunes, and the waiting triremes, a desperate, terrifying retreat under the relentless, hate-fueled spears of the victorious Greeks. The Greeks, fueled by a bloodlust they didn't know they possessed, and the stunning, blinding realization of total victory, chased them directly into the surf, their bronze shields flashing like avenging spirits under the unrelenting Hellenic sun. The clash shifted from a formation battle to 1,000 desperate, personalized duels fought in the churning water, a terrifying, disorganized massacre where the heavy bronze of the hoplites proved crushingly superior even on the uneven, slippery footing of the sand. They hacked, they stabbed, they screamed the names of their gods, knowing deep in their exhausted souls that every Persian who escaped meant a potential return, a future existential threat that Athens could not possibly survive. This was the epicenter of chaotic, unbelievable heroism, played out on the slick, slippery wood of the boarding ramps, where men fell overboard and were instantly swallowed by the depths, weighted down by the very spoils and accoutrements they had hoped to carry home. It was during this suicidal scramble that the Athenians achieved a massive symbolic victory, wresting free the sacred Persian standard, the ultimate visual symbol of Darius's unholy ambition and hubris.
The intense, focused struggle to capture this banner and to deny the enemy safe passage cost many Greek lives, showing the extreme risk taken just to ensure that the enemy fleet could not simply slip away whole and intact, ready to strike elsewhere. In the end, despite the Herculean effort, only 7 ships were successfully boarded, seized, and burned right there on the beach, their oily, black smoke rising as a terrifying, undeniable monument to Greek defiance.
7 ships. It felt like a heartbreakingly small pinprick against the vast, 100-strong armada that still dotted the horizon, ready to execute its escape maneuver. But it was enough to shatter the already fragile morale of the remaining fleeing men. The rest of the colossal Persian fleet, suddenly and chillingly aware that their entire land force had been annihilated in a single impossible hour, began to pull away from the shore with a terrifying synchronized speed, their sails catching the wind. The Athenians watched, exhausted, blood-soaked, covered in the dust of their fallen enemies, but unequivocally victorious, as the great invasion force retreated, momentarily defeated, sailing into the shimmering distance. The casualty count that day was something bordering on the mythological. The Greeks had suffered perhaps fewer than 200 casualties, a number so small, so unbelievably insignificant compared to the Persian losses, estimated tragically at over 6,000 men, that it felt like a direct intervention from the highest Olympian powers.
The Persian ships were not simply running home in shame and defeat. They were executing the second part of the invasion plan, a movement so audacious, so coldly calculated in its ruthless efficiency, that it chilled the blood of every man standing on that triumphant field. The massive fleet had rounded Cape Sunion. They were now heading directly for the sprawling, undefended city of Athens itself, a metropolis emptied of nearly all its fighting-age men, its walls manned only by the old, the sick, and the terrified women and children. The distance from Marathon to Athens by sea was only slightly longer than the rugged distance by land, and the Persian rowers, driven by the searing sting of defeat and the promise of rich, utterly undefended Athenian plunder, could easily make that journey in a matter of hours. If they arrived before the main army could return, Athens would inevitably fall without a single struggle, the ultimate, invaluable prize delivered directly to Darius, while the Greek heroes stood stranded miles away, celebrating a victory that had suddenly become irrevocably meaningless. This was the moment of ultimate existential panic, the terrifying pivot point where victory immediately turned into desperate life-or-death peril. Miltiades knew with sickening certainty that they had mere hours, perhaps 3 or 4 at most, to beat the enemy to the gates of their own city. The hoplites, already having fought a crushing, bone-weary battle, already exhausted by the sheer weight of their bronze armor and the trauma of the slaughter, had to move immediately. They had to run, and they had to run faster than they had ever believed possible. They had to perform a legendary, almost mythological forced march, fully armed, covering over 26 rugged, mountainous miles of sun-baked, unforgiving terrain, to beat the swift-moving Persian fleet to the gates. The fate of Athenian democracy, the fragile, nascent future of the entire Western world, hinged entirely on the sheer speed and inhuman stamina of these few thousand men. The desperate, final order was given, a simple, terrifying command that echoed across the bloody field. To Athens. They didn't even pause to fully strip the armor from the Persian dead, or to properly celebrate their impossible triumph. They grabbed quick rations, snatched up waterskins, adjusted their heavy shields and cumbersome helmets, and began the relentless, heart-stopping, agonizing march. This was no longer a structured military formation. It was a desperate, driven stampede of survival. A mass of weary men moving purely on adrenaline and sheer will. The midday sun beat down mercilessly. The dust rose up to choke their lungs, and the horrifying memory of the blood-soaked field spurred them forward. Every single step a frantic, desperate plea to the gods for impossible speed. Every single man knew the terrifying final stakes. If they failed to arrive in time, their families would be enslaved, their magnificent city burned to the bedrock, and the victory they had just purchased with their very lives would be reduced to nothing but meaningless, tragic dust in the historical wind. This impossible, grueling final run, this ultimate act of superhuman endurance, was the true definition, the eternal core of marathon. The very air above the plain of Marathon still tasted of blood and impossible victory. But the celebration lasted less than a single, horrified heartbeat. Miltiades, the brilliant general whose gamble had just paid off with the lives of 6,000 screaming Persians, did not waste a single second watching his men strip the ornate armor from the fallen enemy. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not over. It was merely intermission before the true, final, devastating act began. The great Persian fleet, bruised but not broken, was already performing a terrifying, calculated maneuver. Their cavalry, those magnificent, terrifying horses that had been kept uselessly out of the main infantry fight, were now being hastily reloaded onto the waiting triremes. The signal was unmistakable. The massive armada was not retreating home in shame. It was preparing to execute Plan B, the most obvious, catastrophic threat to the entire Athenian state. They were sailing straight for the Phaleron Bay, the main port of Athens, which lay completely exposed, 7 hours away by sea. Athens itself, the spiritual heart of Greece, the city holding the wives, children, and elders, was virtually defenseless, stripped bare of every fighting man, every shield, every single spear, in order to stand on that muddy plain. Darius's commanders knew that if they could land their forces before Miltiades' hoplites could march back, they wouldn't need to fight another battle. They would simply occupy the Acropolis and hold the entire population hostage, ending the war without firing another arrow. This realization hit Miltiades like a physical blow, a sudden, cold terror replacing the adrenaline of combat. The distance from Marathon back to Athens, a grueling, bone-jarring 26 miles or 42 kilometers over treacherous, uneven ground, was a physical impossibility for men who had just fought for hours, carrying 60 pounds of bronze and wood, and then spent the morning marching to the battlefield. But there was no choice. The victory at Marathon would become the most tragic footnote in history if Athens fell while its heroes were resting just a day's march away. The stakes were astronomical, the energy required mythological, and the window of opportunity was shrinking with the relentless movement of the sun across the sky. Miltiades issued the order, not a request, but a screaming command that sliced through the exhausted relief of his men. We run, now, for Athens. This was the true, unsung second marathon run, the one that truly saved the civilization, far eclipsing the single messenger's legendary sprint. This was the impossible dash of the entire army. This was the run of the entire army, known historically as the Shield Run, the most incredible feat of mass endurance ever recorded in the ancient world. They had to transform from weary soldiers to elite marathon runners while still wearing the crushing weight of their bronze cuirasses, helmets, and heavy aspirations. They did not stop to eat, drink, or even treat the minor wounds that bled beneath their armor. Every man, driven by the raw, desperate image of their homes burning and their families enslaved, lifted his enormous bronze shield and began to move, a heavy, pounding, agonizing column of exhausted fury, pushing their bodies past the point of sanity and physiological failure. Imagine the heat, the dust clogging their throats, the sheer physical agony of maintaining a running pace in full battle kit for almost 5 hours after having just engaged in the most violent, high-stakes hand-to-hand combat of their lives. It was not courage that moved them now. It was primal, desperate, non-negotiable necessity, the ultimate survival instinct made manifest in a coordinated, desperate sprint. Meanwhile, out on the Aegean, the Persian triremes were flying across the water, their hundreds of oarsmen perfectly synchronized, pushing the fleet relentlessly toward the unprotected coast, confident that their overwhelming speed guaranteed the capture of the city. The Persians had the clear advantage of speed and fresh troops. Every minute the Athenians spent collapsing on the dusty track was a minute gained by the enemy fleet heading for their jugular. But Miltiades, understanding the psychology of war, knew that he didn't necessarily need to beat the fleet to the finish line. He just needed to appear to beat them. He needed to be visible,
a sudden, terrifying apparition to the Persian scouts, confirming that the impossible had happened twice in one day. As the sun began its brutal descent toward the horizon, staining the sky in hues of blood orange and desperate purple, the first exhausted, staggering Athenian hoplites began to crest the final hills overlooking the city, their vision swimming with fatigue. They did not look like heroes. They looked like specters, covered in grime, sweat, and the dried blood of their enemies, their faces masks of pure, unending suffering, their lungs screaming for air. But they were there, and that was all that mattered. At the exact moment the Persian fleet, led by Datis, rounded Cape Sunion and sailed into view of the Bay of Phaleron, preparing their landing formations, their shock was absolute, an instantaneous realization of strategic failure. Their intelligence had been flawless. The entire Athenian army was supposed to still be recovering 26 miles away, incapable of movement. Yet, arrayed on the hills above the coastal landing point, positioned perfectly to defend the city, stood the entire terrifying force that had just massacred their comrades at Marathon. The sight was psychologically devastating. The Athenians were not just present, they were deployed, shields locked, spears ready, looking in that twilight haze as if they had never moved at all, a ghost army summoned by sheer willpower. Datis and Artaphernes, the Persian commanders, were faced with a horrific dilemma. They could attempt a landing against a fresh, well-positioned army, a move that would guarantee another bloodbath, potentially trapping their own forces between the sea and the hills in a costly melee. Or they could recognize the impossible truth. They had been beaten not once, but twice, by sheer superhuman will and the strategic genius of a single desperate man. The Persian fleet hesitated. It lingered for a moment, a vast dark shadow of disappointment upon the water, the moment passing when they could have snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. And then, slowly, agonizingly, recognizing the crushing defeat of their Plan B, the great armada turned its prows back toward the east, disappearing into the gathering darkness and leaving the Athenians victorious. They had fought the gods of geography and fatigue and won. The men who collapsed on the ground after the Persians retreated were not celebrating. They were simply surviving, their bodies finally giving up after the demand of the impossible was met. They had run 26 miles to fight, then fought for hours, and then run 26 miles back again, all within 12 hours. This was not human performance. This was the birth of a legend, carved in muscle, bronze, and the desperate, burning, non-negotiable love for the small, vulnerable city of Athens, the price of freedom measured in miles. The two great armies, the Titan and the fledgling, finally stood motionless across the plain of Marathon. The air itself was a thick, viscous jelly of fear and anticipation, heavy with the scent of salt marsh and the coming doom.
For days they had merely stared, two predators deciding who would make the first fatal move. This wasn't merely a delay. It was a psychological weapon wielded by Datis and Artaphernes, allowing the sheer, terrifying numerical superiority of the Persian forces easily double, perhaps even triple the Greeks, to slowly crush the morale of the defenders. Every Athenian soldier knew this was the end of the line, the final lottery ticket pulled for survival. Inside the Greek camp, the tension was a physical force, tearing the strategoi, the 10 generals, apart. Should they wait for Sparta? Should they retreat to the walls of Athens, surrendering the field and the coastal plain to the relentless advance of the Achaemenid Empire? 5 generals argued for delay, paralyzed by the sight of the Medes' cavalry and archers. 5, led by the fiercely persuasive Miltiades, screamed for immediate, decisive action. Miltiades understood a chilling truth. Waiting only favored the enemy. The longer they delayed, the greater the chance of Athenian internal collapse, or worse, betrayal from those secretly hoping for a quick Persian regime change, seeking to save their property by bending the knee to Darius's gold. He needed to strike now, leveraging the narrow window of opportunity and the element of surprise before the Persians could fully deploy their best units or the dreaded cavalry could exploit the open flanks. It all came down to a single vote, a moment of pure, agonizing democracy under the shadow of annihilation. The polemarch, Callimachus, the official commander-in-chief, held the tie-breaking authority. His decision would either save or damn the entire Greek experiment, a moment of cosmic chance placed on the shoulders of one man. Miltiades, using every ounce of his Chersonese experience fighting the Scythians and his intimate knowledge of Persian military structure, delivered the speech of his life, appealing not to courage, but to the cold calculus of survival. Callimachus wavered, then cast his vote for immediate engagement, choosing glorious risk over certain, slow destruction. Miltiades' plan was not just bold, it was certifiably insane, a total rejection of conventional Hellenic warfare. He knew the typical hoplite phalanx, thick and deep, would simply be swallowed whole by the Persian numbers, dissolved by the sheer weight of humanity. Instead, he stretched his meager 10,000 troops, including the vital, stalwart Plataean allies, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Athenians, until the center line was terrifyingly thin, perhaps only 4 ranks deep. This was the trap, the calculated risk that made every Athenian heart seize up. They were deliberately sacrificing the robust integrity of their center, creating a weak point where the finest Persian infantry, the Saka Scythian archers, and elite light troops would surely punch through, thinking victory was secured and the road to Athens was open. But the flanks, those were packed tight, 8 ranks deep, reinforced with desperation and the best available bronze shields. Miltiades' objective was not to hold the line centrally, where defeat was guaranteed, but to allow the Persian center to penetrate then use the reinforced wings to swing inward like massive, unstoppable iron gates, executing a double envelopment that would turn the Persian advance into a chaotic, suffocating pocket of death and bronze. The Greeks moved into their positions, the rising sun catching the sheen of their bronze helmets and the terrifying reflection of their terror. The Persian army, seeing the thin center, must have scoffed, perhaps even laughed, believing this setup was the desperate final act of a thoroughly doomed enemy, a tactical blunder to be swiftly punished. They expected the slow, stately march of the phalanx, the traditional approach where opposing sides closed slowly, shouting battle cries and adjusting shields. But Miltiades had another surprise waiting, a maneuver so unprecedented it would shock the ancient world. The Dromos, the run. When the distance closed to approximately 1,500 meters, a terrifying stretch of open ground, Miltiades gave the command, and the entire Greek line exploded forward, not walking, but sprinting across the rough plain toward the Persian ranks. They were running headlong into oblivion, a collective act of warrior desperation. This suicidal charge served several tactical purposes that defied all common sense and military tradition. First, it minimized the time the Greeks were exposed to the devastating, suffocating hail of Persian arrows. Every second saved from the relentless rain of death delivered by the Saka bowmen was a life preserved. Second, and perhaps most importantly, it delivered a colossal psychological blow. The Persians had never witnessed such a frantic, desperate, furious charge from a heavy infantry force carrying 70 pounds of bronze and wood. They were not just facing men. They were facing 1,000 bronze-tipped, screaming missiles, powered by the desperate urge to survive. This was an act of sheer, terrifying will that broke the expected rhythm of war. The sound of 10,000 men running, their heavy hobnail boots pounding the earth, the roar of their collective breath turning into a primal scream, was the overture to the battle itself. It was the sound of civilization choosing life over submission, a sound that echoed not just across the plain, but through the millennia, signaling that the rules of war and history itself were about to be violently rewritten. The moment of impact was inevitable, colossal, and deafening. The thin Greek center smashed into the densely packed Persian lines, and the Battle of Marathon, the hinge upon which the future of the West depended, had finally begun. The moment of impact was not a crash, but a sickening, grinding shove, a sound that stole the breath from the entire coastal plain. The Athenian hoplites, shoulder to shoulder, their bronze shields interlocked like the scales of some immense, angry dragon, slammed into the terrifying human wave of the great king. They were outnumbered. They were facing the finest light infantry the known world had ever produced, and every single man knew that his position in the middle was doomed to fail. This thin Greek line, however, was not meant to hold. It was a calculated, agonizing piece of bait laid by the mad genius Miltiades. He had deliberately stripped the center down to the barest minimum, knowing that the heart of his army would have to break, would have to flee, to draw the enemy deep into the killing zone.
The screaming, panicked retreat was not a rout. It was a lethal maneuver designed to deceive the experienced Persian commanders. The Persians, seeing the Greeks falter and the line buckle, roared with triumph, their confidence surging like an unstoppable tide.
Their generals, perhaps forgetting the devastating impact of the Greek wings for a moment in the heat of the clash, poured every reserve, every ounce of their immense momentum into the collapsing center. They were tasting victory, believing the myth that the Greeks were just small, disorganized tribesmen ripe for the taking, confirming their superiority in numbers and reach. They pushed, their ranks deep and inexorable, overwhelming the few remaining Greeks in the center, who fought the delaying action until the very last possible second, before dissolving into a tactical retreat. But as the Persian lines surged forward, intoxicated by the immediate success and chasing the seemingly fleeing Athenian corps, a horrifying realization began to dawn on the flanks of the Achaemenid force. The Greek wings were not retreating. They were not even bending. They were solid, implacable walls of bronze, wood, and pure fury. On the right, the Athenian wing, led by the polemarch Callimachus, a man whose life was measured in duty, was a machine of relentless, coordinated destruction. They were pushing, not just holding ground, but actively driving the massive enemy forces opposite them back toward the treacherous, soft marshland that lined the shallow bay. Every shield bash, every spear thrust, was executed with the coordinated, terrifying discipline of the phalanx. This was warfare that the Persians, accustomed to fluid cavalry maneuvers, rapid missile fire, and open formations, were simply unprepared to counter in the tight, brutal confines of close-quarters combat. The roar of the Persian charge turned into cries of confusion, then screams of pure, unadulterated terror. As the central Persian force continued their deep penetration, chasing the retreating Greeks inward across the plain, Miltiades gave the unseen signal, the cue for the true, devastating counterattack. The two immense Greek wings, having driven their immediate opponents to the breaking point, began their dramatic inward rotation. They didn't just stop pushing forward. They executed the most difficult and decisive maneuver in ancient infantry combat, the double envelopment, the very shape of the crescent moon turning to a crushing fist. The Persian army, moments ago so vast and unstoppable, now found itself compressed, trapped, and utterly surrounded on three sides by hoplites wielding spears nearly 3 meters long and shields that formed an unbroken barrier. The fighting instantly changed from a battle of opposing lines to a desperate, suffocating slaughter. The tight, formidable formation that made the Persian centers so powerful, their depth of ranks, now became their death sentence, a horrifying mechanism of internal collapse. They could barely lift their short bows. They couldn't effectively swing their shorter, lighter weapons in the confined space. Men were crushed between their comrades and the relentless bronze wall closing in, their own numbers working against them, turning the pride of Darius's army into a panicked, suffocating mess of bodies and broken steel. This was not a tactical withdrawal followed by a skirmish. This was a complete, systematic annihilation of the enemy's formation, a geometric killing zone designed for maximum lethality. The Greeks were performing a killing ballet, moving with a synchronized, disciplined ferocity born of desperation and the absolute knowledge that failure meant the immediate end of their civilization. The fighting continued in this cramped, inescapable hellscape for what felt like an eternity. The Greeks, despite their mounting exhaustion, found a seemingly limitless reserve of rage and terror. They had sacrificed their center, but the cost was now being repaid tenfold in blood and sheer, unadulterated panic. Finally, the surviving core of the Persian center, those who had not yet been trampled, pierced, or crushed, broke. Not in an organized retreat, but in a panicked, disorganized tidal wave, scrambling backward toward the perceived safety of the beach, where their massive fleet, their beautiful, life-saving triremes awaited them. Miltiades saw the break and knew the battle was only half won. If the Persians reached their ships and managed to sail away with their main fighting force intact, they would simply regroup, rearm, and land elsewhere to try again. This moment of rout was the final critical window of opportunity. The hoplites, despite having fought for hours under the blistering Attic sun, now found a new, agonizing burst of speed, running down their terrified, fleeing enemies. The Battle of Marathon transformed from a disciplined infantry clash into a desperate, bloody foot race to the sea, a scramble for survival. Every man knew the stakes: kill them now or face them again tomorrow as they burned Athens to the ground. The fate of the Hellenic world was now measured in the distance between the Greek spear tips and the hulls of the retreating Persian ships, bobbing tantalizingly close to shore. The beach became a tableau of unimaginable chaos, with men drowning in the shallows, desperately clawing their way onto the gangplanks, their dreams of conquering Greece dissolving into the dark, indifferent Aegean. The fighting was brutal, personal, and utterly unforgiving, as the Athenians chased the invaders right into the surf, determined to ensure that not a single fighting man escaped Miltiades' deadly, brilliant trap. The battle had reached its final, agonizing crescendo.